they haven't done it long enough to realize that it's usually not that dangerous.
It's not the conflict that you need to be worried about.
Literally asking me why I asked for backup.
If departments continue to look at patrol officers as individuals who are not capable, they will always be not capable.
Welcome to the Defenders and Disciples podcast. In this interview, I had the pleasure of speaking with Brad over at Surviving the Street, and with his permission, I uploaded the interview to this channel. If you want to check out more of what Brad's doing over at Surviving the Street, then check the link in the description. But for now, enjoy our discussion on complacency and policing.
Taylor, thanks for being on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Brad. It's great to be here.
Awesome. Some technical difficulties for the last 15 minutes or so, but we're good. So I think several months ago, probably by now, you had sent me a document, and the title of that document is called Complacency Kills. Mm-hmm. And as I was reading over that document, I thought there was several things on there. Actually, there's 33 different points being made on there?
33, yeah.
And, right off the bat, the very first few ones that I read, I was like, oh, this stuff's pretty good, and I felt like this could be a very good conversation to have. And we could just basically go down the list of things and talk about, my opinion, your opinion on those things as it relates to law enforcement itself. So this Complacency Kills document, can you talk a little bit about how it came about and what its purpose is?
Sure, yeah. So a few years ago, my good friend and zone partner at the time, we were on a call, and the call was for an open door possible burglary, and all the evidence was pointing towards it was founded. And so I requested another unit to be en route to assist with searching the structure because it was a very large house. And like I said, the evidence pointed towards it being founded. So we thought there's possibly someone inside. It just looked like it had been ransacked. But so the other unit was en route, but we went ahead and started the searching process while they were en route and searched the building. And in typical, law enforcement situations, it was nothing. I mean, there was no one inside. And then after searching and clearing it out and then locking it and then clearing the call, I had my sergeant call me, and he asked what had happened and kind of started to ask why we asked for another unit. And he was literally asking me why I asked for backup. And I was kind of taken back by this, that why a sergeant was asking why I asked for backup. But I explained to him, and his reasoning by the end of our call was he was more concerned about I guess you'd call it the public optics of the other officers towards myself and my zone partner. I guess we couldn't handle business, so we had to call for backup. And I explained to him, well, it seemed like it was founded. And my thinking was, if we go in there and one of us gets shot and killed and now the other one's there, it would be at least a good idea to have someone en route, because this wasn't a busy day. We had plenty of units on shift, and there weren't that many calls on the call screen. So I didn't really see an issue with it. I thought it was exercising really good officer safety. And so after we get off that phone call, I parked my car in a parking lot, and I was just kind of reeling and thinking about that conversation. And it kind of started to motivate me to start keeping a list of times where I would notice complacency. So I literally just pulled up the notes app on my iPhone, and I started writing down examples of complacency. And, this list here, I have it in front of me. It's not, I just continue to add to the list every time I observed complacency. And it wasn't just complacency in others, but also complacency in myself, because we're all guilty of complacency at some level. And, the list is a mixture of guidelines, principles, I'd call it maybe best practices. Some might disagree. And then other rules that I think are important. And the way I was writing it is almost like if I was going to talk to a junior officer and kind of give them this list and say here's how you can stave off complacency. That's kind of the mindset I was writing it in. And, some deal with tactics while others deal with shaping someone's mindset. And then the list concludes with three, what I guess you can call leadership principles that are directed more towards leaders and supervisors. And I'll get into this later, but there's a reason I use the word leaders instead of supervisors, because I think there's a big difference there.
Right. So, at what point in your career did you start writing these things down, and for how long were you writing them down for?
It it was probably about 2 years, probably 2 years into my career that I noticed it, or that I started writing it, because I had at least a catalog of instances I could refer back to and start creating these bullet points based around. And then once I started it, I just continued to add to it. Every so often, something would, come to the surface, and I would add it to the list. And I would try to make it as general as possible so that it would apply to law enforcement, and not just law enforcement, but also military and even civilian context, across the board. But there's a underlying example, or some sort of a vignette that happened that I'm actually referenced or that used to build that rule, and we can get into those as well.
Right. So the very first line says, one of the most dangerous parts about being a police officer is that it is usually not that dangerous. And that says a whole lot of things, you know? And I think that is complacency, right? Like that is exactly what that is. It's, hey, we've done this so many times and we've been fine. And so you develop a certain level of comfortability to continue doing those things because, in the instances in which you've been taking police action, you have not met resistance and certainly probably not met somebody who was actively not only trying to seriously hurt or kill you, but also dedicated to doing just that, right? So one of the most dangerous parts about being a police officer is that it is usually not that dangerous. What's your experience with that? And what was it that made you kind of write that down? Maybe not even write it down entirely, but it's the very first thing.
If you're interested in new innovative training tools, then you have to check out Ace VR. And make sure to use promo code DEFENDERS to get 1 month free. I'll admit that when I first heard about this device, I thought it was probably a gimmick and there was no way it would feel realistic. But the moment I put on the headset and held the controller, it was obvious to me that we had stepped into a new era of firearms training. Not only does the virtual reality environment accurately represent the real world, but the pistol controller has the same weight and feel of a real gun. And the trigger feels just like an actual trigger. With Ace VR, you can play several different game modes, from drills that work on the fundamentals of marksmanship to competitive stages, and even more entertaining modes that work on situational awareness. You can also compete with friends and others in the Ace community. And don't forget to use promo code DEFENDERS to get 1 month free. Yeah, so I think this kind of sets the foundation for the entire document. And it's more of a truism, I guess you could say, and instead of a rule. And like kind of like you said, statistically speaking, most calls do not involve violence because most people are compliant. Your badge and your authority are the only thing you need to gain compliance with most people, because most people, like you said, are not willing to fight you, and they're not willing to, get into a gunfight or whatever. And so this means ultimately that you can theoretically do your job and respond to most calls without your duty belt and not have any issues. And when I say without your duty belt, you know what I'm saying. You're like no gun, no pepper spray, no taser or anything, and not have any issue, because most people are going to comply. And I don't want anyone to test that theory, but I think it's true. And this reality that the most dangerous thing about policing means that, or the most dangerous thing in policing is that it's usually not that dangerous. This reality enables the slow creep of complacency to build, right? So how many brand new officers do you know that are complacent?
Well, I guess that we would have to define what brand new means, but if we're talking about officers that are right out of the academy, I would say in that context, it would be pretty close to zero.
I would
But
agree with that.
yeah, but they're also doing things and operating under a certain level of not being able to fully understand too, right?
I completely agree. Yes, their
Yeah.
ignorance is they are maybe ignorant, right? But they're not complacent. So I think there's a difference there. But the reason for that, I think that most of them are not complacent is because they haven't done it long enough to realize that it's usually not that dangerous. And so, while yes, a lot of them do have bad tactics, unfortunately, that's the case as well. So it's kind of this weird conflict where it's like in the early stages you're not complacent, but then as you get more advanced, you learn the job better, but then maybe you get more complacent. So it's trying to, let's get better at our tactics and get better at doing the job, and then also maintain vigilance and stave off complacency for as long as we can, right? I think that should be the ultimate goal.
Yeah, I do also wonder, thinking about it, when does that when do you start to develop that certain level of comfortability? And not I'm
Mm-hmm.
not talking about it's hard for me to, you know, reflect on it from a personal standpoint or from my personal experiences because I came from the military as did you, and
Mm-hmm.
so that mindset was always something that I had,
Mm-hmm.
and so for me, I mean, comfortable in a different way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Comfortable, confident, and but being able to identify these things, and so I wonder at what point, because being out on the street and seeing officers move around, make decisions or not make decisions, and just do things. I wonder when they start building those the ability to become complacent,
Mm-hmm.
and does that possibly even start as soon as they leave the academy and start having these experiences, right? And I think probably a big part of that is, when you leave the academy and you go on your training program, whatever the time period that is, you get assigned a training officer, maybe several training officers, and so you're even getting to experience, the way that we do it is you're going to have three different training officers and then a different officer grading you, right? So
Mm-hmm.
so you're going to get a chance to experience policing in almost three different styles or three different ways, and so you might have, and I actually don't remember, to be honest with you. um, the large part of my field training had really nothing to do with safety. I'm just like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't recall. My evening shift trainer was awesome, and he was the best one that I had. But if looking back on it, I don't really remember being like critiqued or talked about unsafe practices or, hey, don't do this. Hey, stand over here.
Yeah.
Like, hey, let's call him back and let's put him in a compromising position first. I don't remember doing any of that. It felt like it was all administrative, all about kind of checking the boxes of what was
Mm-hmm.
required to expose you to, all along the way, being graded on officer safety, even though
Mm-hmm.
like in the field it wasn't really talked about. You know.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have any
Yeah,
experiences with that?
I think I had a very similar experience, and we were graded on officer safety, but a lot of times it felt like, well, one, it's assuming that that FTO knows what officer safety actually is, and that are not, they haven't built their tactical portfolio on bad tactics because there's usually not a bad guy there. So one of the other rules, actually, I think it's the next rule is, I don't know if you want to jump into that next. I think it would be a good segue, but bad tactics only work when there's no bad guy. And I think that's true because, if there's a house with no one inside of it and you have to clear it out, well, you can basically do whatever you want. You can do whatever you want in the threshold. You can do whatever you want in terms of picking up corners, and it doesn't really matter because there's no bad guy. There's no one there to test your tactics. And so I think that a lot of these FTOs, when they're grading people on, maybe not a lot, that might be overstepping, but several FTOs, when they're grading people on officer safety, they're basing it on what they understand to be effective officer safety. And I think there's a lot of instances where it's true. Like if you are putting yourself in a very compromising position. Like it's obvious that you're putting yourself in a compromising position. But I think then there's other situations where it's you're still not using good officer safety, but they don't understand you're not using good officer safety. And I'll use passenger side versus driver side approach. I at one point just completely stopped doing driver side approaches, and obviously there's exceptions, right? If for some reason there's like they're parked so far to the shoulder and there's like a cliff, I'm not going to rock climb the cliff to be able to do a passenger side approach. But honestly, I don't think that ever happened. I don't think I was ever in a situation where I couldn't do that. And so I just started doing exclusively passenger side approaches. And I would not only do a passenger side approach, I wouldn't just walk directly. I would like take a kind of a go out at an angle and then walk at an angle to the passenger side so I could see inside the car for a long period of time and sneak up on them. And there's so many situations where you can do a passenger side approach, but yet people don't do it because it's just they don't want to say it's an ordinary traffic stop, but they treat it like it's an ordinary traffic stop. And I know it's not ordinary traffic stop. There's another word they use for that, but it's oftentimes we treat it like that. And so I agree with you, though. I think that there isn't as much of an emphasis. And in terms of when it happens and when that actual, the complacency creeps in, I don't think it's necessarily binary. Not necessarily that I don't think you're saying that, but I think it's such a slow creep that it's almost hard to even notice. And especially for officers who never encounter violence or never encounter that person who actually does test their tactics or check them, I think that it's even easier for it to creep in.
Yeah, I think that these first 2 points, we could really just stop at right here, and we can fill in whatever else is in this document into this conversation of these 2 points. And so, it's not that dangerous, and so you build these expectations up of the way that you want things to go or believe that they will go. And then what happens when you are executing bad tactics or not following proper procedure, and of course the bad guy isn't truly that bad, it works out. But when the bad guy is a true believer and decides to do whatever he wants to do with you and take advantage of you, you find yourself in a place of a high level of uncertainty, right? And you said that bad tactics, when there's no bad guy, seemingly the tactics are valid, right? But we can also say the same thing about good tactics or tactics in general, right? When, again, this is like, maybe, force on force stuff or this type of training, we're training on the flat range, doing these things in these controlled environments in a way in which it's taught, in a way in which we believe it's the best way based on how we have constructed this environment, to fit the tactic or vice versa. But when we do that, the conditions have to be what the conditions are because of the constructs of the range, right? And so we can teach and talk about a way of doing something. Say we have paper targets in this ammunition house, right? And hey, we're going to clear this house and we're doing these things. And this is how we've always done it. And seemingly it's the best way. But then maybe when you take a step back and you're like, well, what if this was a real person? Okay, well, how would he actually respond in this situation? Or how have they responded in these situations? And so, I think that, yes, bad tactics do work when the bad guy is not a threat, but also you sometimes find out that what you think is good tactics also doesn't work out when the bad guy is an actual threat. And we know that's true because what happens when an officer gets killed or seriously hurt? Almost always there's a change or there's a recommendation or there's, hey, officers need to have, officers need to have, helmets now in high threat scenarios because we had an officer get, shot in the head. Okay. Well, hey, we had this situation. We had time to get a shield, but we didn't get a shield because we didn't have any available to us. An officer got hurt. Okay. Hey, now we need shields. Hey, we made the decision to push here, but did anybody ask this other question about this or that that would have
Mm-hmm.
caused us to not have to push in that moment? Well, no, we didn't. Okay, we need to start implementing that into our training, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that is the adaptation and the evolution of tactics itself, right? And so,
Yeah.
but we want to at all costs avoid those things. And try to figure that out in training, be forward thinking, make
Yeah.
those decisions based on the best information we possibly can. And then, maybe if something does, the way that I talked to my team about these things when we were planning warrants was, I want to go into this thing, this plan, this operation, and I want to have the mindset and have the ability to, if something goes wrong, someone gets hurt, to tell your family, for you to tell my family that, like, we had this thing buttoned up, like we did
Mm-hmm.
everything that we could, we made the best decisions we possibly could at the time. And if we could go back in time and make better decisions, we don't think that there was any decisions that we could have made
Mm-hmm.
differently with the information that we had. And it just
Mm-hmm.
wasn't his day. He got
Yeah.
the best of us. It's a dangerous thing. And so that was what I always projected onto my team. Like, in the after action debrief, we should be able to say, the list of things that you have to critique shouldn't be that big. You know what I mean? That's the
Mm-hmm.
goal. If you're in there for 3 hours trying to figure out what went wrong, like, you probably didn't do do your best at planning that thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so back on the training aspect of it with these, I've had this question. I'm sure you've had the question. I've had people reach out to me on the Instagram or wherever and ask, hey, I'm starting the FTO program, or hey, I'm going to be an FTO, and what's your advice?
If you ever find yourself in a situation where you have to use deadly force to defend yourself or to defend someone else, then you're going to want a good legal team defending you after the fact. And that's why I trust attorneys on retainer. And if you want to see how AOR compares to those other CCW insurance providers, then scan this QR code or check out my affiliate link in the description. They have individual and family plans so that you will be legally protected should you ever need to protect your life or someone else's life. And don't forget to use promo code DAD to save $25 on your initial sign up.
And I had aspirations to be a field trainer before I actually knew what it took, on the administrative side and kind of what they were actually looking for. And I don't really plan on doing that. But this is the truth. Like, this is day one. You show up and you're in front of me and you're going out on the street. I'm going to straight up tell you the most important thing is safety. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's not how you write your reports. It's not how good you tag evidence or the process. It's not even how well you process a scene.
Yeah.
Okay. Because all of those things that are important, but sometimes more important, right, to some people, you can figure out after the fact. You can call somebody and say, hey, I don't know what to do with this situation. What do I do? Hey, hold the scene, tape it off. We're coming out there. Hey, I have this piece of evidence. I've never done this before. How do I do this? Hey, did you take pictures? Okay, yeah, I'll take pictures. Yeah, document this, call these people. All that stuff can be figured out.
Yeah.
But what we can't go back on is the fact that you made a decision that got yourself seriously hurt. Okay. And so, above all else, safety is the most important thing. All these other things you have to know, you have to be good at, you have to understand, but we can figure those out, right? So that's my tip, I guess you could say, to new FTOs or officers going into that program. So let's get into number 3, which is kind of a little bit of a longer one, but it says, do not blindly follow or spread tactical dogma, and do not trust tactics, techniques that have not been vetted through force on force. Not only does force on force pressure test tactics, techniques, it also gives those who plan to use them the confidence that they will work. Use of blue guns without man marking rounds cannot replace true force on force training. Finally, implement holistic force on force training that includes the entire force continuum. So you want to speak on that?
Sure. Yeah. So once again, this one builds on the previous one, and that's kind of the pattern throughout this document. And as complacent officers who have gotten by by using those bad tactics, or even the good tactics that maybe work on paper targets but are still fundamentally bad tactics. As those officers are promoted throughout the ranks, they then inculcate those bad tactics on the next generation. So, be it the field training officer or a firearms instructor or defensive tactics instructor, sorry to use so many air quotes, they spread those bad tactics throughout the department. And then that turns into, to steal Pat Mack's phrase, institutional inbreeding, and that trickles down and just continues to fester throughout the department. And then those bad tactics are reinforced again and again as junior officers respond to those non-issue calls. So and so FTO or so and so firearms instructor or so and so DT instructor told me about this tactic, and I used it and it worked because, like you said, that person wasn't there, that, as you call it, the standard wasn't there to test you, and it works. And so you think that it actually is going to work every time, when in reality, you just got lucky because most people are compliant. So I think that it's important for people to question tactics. And there's an example I want to use where I was backing up it was an FTO and his recruit on a traffic stop. And I think it was this recruit's like trial week. I can't remember what they call it now, but basically where like you're not actually being tested. You're just following the FTO, the field training officer, and you're almost like their backup, and you're observing them before you're actually getting observed and tested or evaluated yourself. And so this recruit, so I had for some reason they were in the continuous left turn lane where they had this traffic stop. I guess that's just where the person stopped. The FTO was on the driver's side, okay, and then the recruit was on the passenger side. But he was on the passenger side with his back to the car, and he was at the C pillar, or between the B and the C pillar, with his back to the car, almost like looking over his shoulder into the car. I can't. It's almost embarrassing to describe like what he was doing. But so I'm kind of further back, off to the back right corner of the car, just observing through the back window, and I'm not gonna. I don't know what's going on, so I'm just gonna kind of wait. And some people may not understand this, but like sometimes when you back someone up like mid call, you don't really understand the context, so it's kind of difficult sometimes to, or you may have a resistance to like step in and be like, hey, hold on, why are we doing this? Let's fix this. Sometimes you just want to be like, okay, I'm just going to see what's happening. Once it's done, hopefully nothing bad happens, and we'll kind of do a little mini debrief. So like most traffic stops, nothing happens, nothing bad happens. We come back, the FTO's working on either the citation or something, and I asked the recruit, I said, hey, I'm just curious, why were you standing like that? He was like, what do you mean? I was like, why were you standing like with your back to the car? I'm just curious why you're doing that. He said, well, that's how they taught us in the academy. I said, okay. I said, why? And he had no response. Like he realized it just as much as I did, that what he was doing was complete BS. It hadn't been tested. He was like, oh crap, like, yeah, I feel like an idiot right now. And I wasn't trying to make him feel like an idiot, but at the end of it, I said, yeah, just keep in mind that like sometimes you will be told to do things, and it's really important to ask why and understand that it is legitimate. And if the person who's telling you to do it cannot tell you why, then, and obviously if it's a high stress situation and there's someone telling you to do something, that's not maybe the time to question, but a lot of times there is time to question. And if someone can't tell you why they're telling you to do something, then they probably don't know either. And unfortunately, a lot of cops have very fragile egos, is what my experience has been, and they don't like to be questioned on things. And so it creates this environment where questions are not invited, and understanding the fundamental why is not a habit. And so these things, again, just get promulgated through the department, and no one ever asks why.
Yeah. So there's a lot of different things there. So I think that the first thing is, and I talk about the officers. I mean, they're just people. Like they're
Yeah.
people with different experiences, different cultures, different mindsets, different interests, different wants, different needs. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
and so I think that is kind of something to consider. And that's why, I talk about individual capable officers, you know, and make all the best I can do is make them aware, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
I cannot make you do anything.
Mm-hmm.
I cannot make you believe in this process, or make you
Right.
believe that you should probably value your life. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Um, some choose to and some not. And you talked about showing up on a scene and not really knowing what's going on, and that is the normal process. And again, you're just thinking from a safety perspective. And so what I've also found, somewhat recently over the past 6 or 7 months or so, is some officers won't even listen to you on the scene itself, like in the moment, during a tactical situation.
Mm-hmm.
And for a number of different reasons. I think there's people that have been on so long and are so complacent they don't
Mm-hmm.
care, so they're just not listening to you because they don't care. I've also experienced officers who at least project themselves as somebody who may be good at these things, and that's
Mm-hmm.
about it, right? And so I feel like they feel like listening to you in the moment, hurts their ego or their ability.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so they literally will not listen to what you have to say in the moment, because they feel like giving up that thing means, hey, you're right, you know more than me, and I'm not actually as good as I think that I am, right?
Mm-hmm.
To the extent of like, on a scene, I noticed something that was on a potential. Well, I noticed a potential suspect who could have been armed, and based on what I was seeing on his person, and the call did involve a gun, and the other officer was in the doorway, and I told him, hey, step back, hey, come back, and he didn't listen to me. Like, he heard me, he just didn't care, and it is at the point at times where you have to not only think about, as the individual officer, like the best tactical decisions that need to be made, but then also factor in that these other officers, like, they might be in your way, right? They might just, you can only put so much thought and emphasis on, okay, what am I doing to be
Yep.
safe, and what tactical decisions do I need to make, and then also be concerned about what other officers are doing. Like, there's only so much bandwidth for that. And
Mm-hmm.
so it does get to a point where you're like, okay, like, that is what that is. I need to do
I
what
got to
I
be
need to
worried
do
about
now in this
myself.
moment. Yeah, exactly. Well, for yourself, but also to the benefit of the tactical situation. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so uh, there is also, you talked about in there, blindly following bad tactics or techniques, and you asking, hey, why did you do this? And they said, well, that's what we were taught. And what I've learned, over the past several years, and I say 8 years, 8, 9 years, is that a lot of officers just don't know. Like, they don't have the information. They haven't been exposed to it. Yeah, they're doing this because that's what they were taught, but they don't know that there's another option. And not every officer has the ability to think critically about the situation, and think about angles, and think about probabilities and statistics. And they don't watch body cameras. You know what I mean? Um, and so maybe they're also just not interested in caring either, right? So I just do this because that's what we were taught. So there is that going on.
Yeah.
You talked about, not just using blue guns, but I don't think you used the word simunition, but force on force, to pressure test tactics and techniques. And this is a really simple way of thinking about this. For whatever reason, you know, first of all, there's many books written on this topic. I have a book behind me that's called Training at the Speed of Life. It's all about, I think it's the guy
Mm.
who created simunition. But it talks about, the benefits of simunition, force on force training. And, there's many great minds that are well beyond my ability to think like they do and have the information that they have, who understand the importance of the force on force, training. And think of it in this way, in this context. It's like, okay, if your only option was to dry fire in your house, right? But you didn't have the opportunity to go to the range. Well, okay, that's probably the best you can do, right?
Mhm.
People would agree with that. Well, it's like, well, if you wanted to get better at marksmanship, what could you do that would be better than that? Well, probably go shoot your actual gun on the range, right?
Mhm.
So there's levels to these things, and being able to, um, being available to go do these things, but also being exposing yourself to these things and doing the better thing that you could be doing to get closer to the real thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what force on force does, right? Force on
Mm-hmm.
force gets you as close as possible to
Yep.
the real event, and it cannot be replicated anywhere else under any other circumstances, right? Everybody knows we're not shooting real guns at each other. That would be, you know, ridiculous. You know
That'd
what
be
I
the
mean?
next
And
level.
yeah, I mean, that would actually cross the level of this is just not good at all, right? But maybe you would say, hey, like a real experience, right? A real life experience out on the street where it did involve those things. Now, I would argue you're not really training at that point. You're executing off of the information that you've developed,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
But that experience is the most valuable experience that you could probably have. In terms of, we call it a gunfight, call it a fight, call it whatever you want to call it, right? It also kind of depends on how you evaluate that yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But force on force training gets you as close as possible to the real thing. Officers react very similarly, if not the same. In my experiences, I do force on
Yep.
force training. My thing is, look, it's the missing puzzle piece. Okay.
Yep.
Yes, sure. We do force on force training, but if you added up the hours of the classes that cops are required to take, right, versus how much force on force the individual officer gets. Okay. Not talking about 15 officers show up to a class and only 3 officers shoot in this scenario and that's it. I'm talking about individual officers, time behind the simunition gun on an actual physical target who is, needs to be dealt with, maybe shooting back. How much time is that? And it's pretty close to zero.
Yeah.
I'll just be, just be
100%.
honest with
Yeah.
you. It's pretty close to zero. And so we have 60 hours of administrative classes and these things that we're doing. And we have almost close to 0 hours, literal hours behind the gun,
Yep.
and things that are closer to the real thing. And so that's what I focus on is the force on force interactions, because what I see is that, hey, like, you watch a body cam video, an officer, most cops end up really kind of pointing the gun and pulling the trigger without,
Mm-hmm.
consideration for their sights or what the target is doing. And it's not to say these cops can't shoot, right? I did a video, my most recent one on the Instagram, and the cop was like 3 yards away with a staccato. He had an optic, had a light, which doesn't mean that you can shoot, but I'm pretty positive that he can shoot a paper target at 3 yards and hit him,
Yep.
hit the target in the chest, right?
Yep.
And there's more that goes into that. He did shoot fast, but ultimately he point shot, and you look at where they even said the rounds hit, which is speculative in my opinion. Because based on just like how the guy actually reacted, they called them, they called them bullet wounds, right? So it doesn't indicate necessarily that he was grazed. Maybe he hit the concrete and it chipped up and hit him in the face, but the guy was stable, up, alert, talking. And the only wound that they referenced providing medical to was a chest seal, right? But they said he got hit in the face, the chest, the stomach, and the right arm. And one round was unaccounted for. The other thing about that is they recovered 4 different bullet fragments, and they listed the fragments in different ways, like jacketed bullet. I don't remember exactly what it said, but you don't usually list those things if they're inside of people. Okay. So my belief is that they probably hit off the ground, hit the wall, hit the storefront, hit whatever. They recovered them as evidence and marked whatever else places he got hit. Right. But I also say, okay, but theoretically, let's just say the officer hit this guy where they say he did. 1 round's unaccounted for. And if I put a paper target at 3 yards on the range and the target looks like 1 in the chest, 1 in the stomach, 1 in the face, and 1 in the right arm, you'd be like, hey, dude, what are you doing? you know? And so you ask yourself, well, why? Right? Because what he did is just the typical thing. I've talked to many cops about their shootings when they talk to me about what they did. And I require that they just give me the honest information so I can share the best information possible while keeping their, situation, not public.
Yep.
And what happens is they abandon marksmanship in a high stress situation because they remain focused on the threat. The marksmanship piece becomes a fleeting thought. They point the gun and pull the trigger until the thing stops doing what it's doing, or they catch themselves in the shooting process. And the only way that you train that, right? The only way that you train, inducing physiological responses to stress and also paying attention to their marksmanship and having conversation about marksmanship is closer to the real thing, right? So in that one, in the class that I teach, exploiting accuracy, that's what we do. Guess what? What they do in that class is what they do out on the street, right?
Mm-hmm.
No difference in terms of marksmanship and their ability to hit and where they hit and the percentage. It's the same. We make adjustments, we talk about things, and then what do you know? We're back up, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, what we need to do, I mean, training in general, not to go off on a tangent, probably already did, but the whole philosophy behind training, needs to change, right?
Yeah.
Will it change? I don't know. Is it too far gone? Maybe. And so, are you going to change legislative, documents that say XYZ in terms of training? There's a lot of really good people in law enforcement in the training side of things that they have their own opinions. They'd love to do things, right? They'd love to do things their way and get these cops what they need. And maybe they just can't do it because of whatever that is, right? And so I kind of fall back on, you know what? It's kind of obvious that safety or this part of the job, it's not the most important part of the job to people who have the ability to make mandatory requirements in terms of training. And if it was, you would at least see somewhat of a balance, right?
Yeah.
In terms of training.
Well, you
But
mentioned
that's not really
marksmanship,
what we see.
and marksmanship is one of those things where, in the police academy and even in service training, we were always taught front sight focused, front sight focused. We didn't have at the time, I don't know if they have them now, but we didn't have red dot sights. So we had iron sights. And front sight focused, front sight focused. And like, I wrote an entire article about this on my blog and how I believe that front sight focus is, one, it's not the safest way to engage a threat. And two, it's not, well, several things. It's not the safest way. It's not the most effective way. And it's not the most ethical way to engage a threat, because I, for the longest time, have been doing target focus. And a lot of times when I bring up target focus to people, they think I'm talking about point shooting or kinesthetic shooting. And that's not at all what I'm talking about. I'm still using my sights. I'm getting sight alignment, equal height, equal light between the front sight post and the rear sight, front sight post and the rear sight notch. But my eyes are converging on the target. My focus, the target is crystal clear. I have double vision on the sights, and the target and the sights are blurry, but I'm still aligning them. And that is effective. In my experience, you can do it out to like 50 and 60 yards on a man-size IPSC steel target. But so they teach them this sight-focused fire, sight-focused aiming in the static range when you're shooting at these cardboard targets that, one, they're not moving. Two, they have good contrast with their backgrounds, right? So you're not having to process much beyond the, if you have double vision on the target and your eyes are converged on your front sight post, it's not that difficult to understand where your target is, as opposed to someone who's moving in and out of cover, who is elevating and lowering their threat condition, and who you may have to identify having a weapon. And so, and even if you say, well, I'm going to look at the person, and then before I take the shot, I'm going to bring my focal plane and my eye convergence back to the front sight post. Even if you say that's what you're going to do, well, now you're adding on, in my estimation, between a quarter and a half a second of time on top of your process, on top of your reaction time, which is about a quarter of a second. So nearly 0.75 to 1 second of time between the person doing something that giving you a stimulus to tell you to take the shot, and now reacting to that, and now bringing your focus back to the front sight post, and then prepping the trigger and shooting the person, as opposed to keeping your focus on the person and bringing your sights into your vision, and then still getting good sight alignment, sight picture, and taking the shot. And so what's happening is we're training people how to shoot in this one way on the range, and they're getting into a stressful situation that they've probably never been in before, and they're having someone try to kill them. And now you're telling them, all right, focus on something that is 2 feet in front of your face versus the thing that's trying to kill you. So for one, it's just not natural to do that. That would be like getting into a fist fight and looking at your fists. And then two, it's also not ethical. And what I mean by that is, if you're focusing on the thing that's 2 feet in front of your face and not on the threat, well, now you don't know whether or not that person is surrendering, if they have changed their threat condition, or if now they're more of a threat. And so it's just, that was one of my biggest pet peeves when I was a police officer, and the type of training we received. There was this one instance where I was shooting, and I was probably 5 yards away from the target, and I'm keyholing. It's like a quarter size group at 5 yards. And I kid you not, one of the instructors came up to me and said, "Hey, are you looking at your front sight post or are you looking at the target?" And the reason he asked this is because I had actually brought this up before and I had shared this article with him that I wrote. And he knew what I was looking at. I said, "I'm looking at the target." He's like, "Well, I think if you looked at your front sight post, you might be able to tighten that group up a little bit." Like, okay, even if that's the case, like, what am I losing to gain what a dime size accuracy from a quarter? And I don't even think that would be the case. I can shoot, I can hit the same hole while doing target focus shooting with iron sights. But it's just once it's that instructing for the sake of instructing or coaching for the sake of coaching, as opposed to results driven coaching, which is what are we looking to accomplish here? Safety, accuracy, and speed. Are they doing those things? If they're doing those things and they're doing a teacup hold on the gun and they're beating everyone else on the range, don't say anything to them. Whatever they're doing is working. And I think it's part of the ego thing too with officers where we put such a premium on being an instructor. It's like, oh, that person's an instructor. And really it just means they probably took an 8-hour course and they got, checking the box to become an instructor or took instructor development training. And now they're an instructor. May not actually mean that they know what they're doing or know what they're saying. It's just, do they have the years in service? Good. Do they have the instructor development course? Good. All right, you're an instructor. Ominous dominus. And so, yeah, the teaching people one thing on the range, whereas that's unrealistic in a real life environment. And that's why I love Force on Force. And when I first started watching your channel, those blue guns in the back, those Force on Force guns in the back, that told me right away where your values were and that you valued Force on Force. And I believe that department's ammo budget should be broken up 80-20. 80% of that ammo budget should go towards simunition, UTM, whatever brand you want to use, airsoft, if that's all you can afford. And then 20% should go towards your live fire budget. And that would include both your defensive rounds and your ball ammo, right? So once everyone knows how to put rounds on paper, good. That is like the bare minimum. Like that's how to strike a punching bag. Okay, like we're a boxing analogy. Now we're going to move up to sparring, and so I think that more emphasis should be placed on that, even to the point of, all right, we're going to go to the range with sim rounds, and instead of shooting paper targets today, we're going to break up into two groups. Half of you are going to go down range and just stand there. You got full safety gear and stuff on, and we're going to shoot you. We're going to shoot a 3-dimensional target. Now, walk towards the person and shoot them. Now run towards the person and shoot them. Now turn sideways and shoot them, so that we're building the ability to shoot a 3-dimensional target and understand that we're working in 3 dimensions, well, 4 dimensions if you include time, and not 2 dimensions. And so, yeah, to say all that, I really do value Force on Force.
You talked about going to the range and shooting. Were you talking about simunition?
Simunition. Sorry. Yes. Let me clarify.
I mean, I think you said it. I don't know. I didn't really quite catch the first couple words, so I just wanted to clarify that, obviously.
Yeah. We're not in Russia.
Yeah. And so one more point before we move on to the next one, is, I talked about maybe you just don't know, right? What the proper procedure is or what the better way of doing something is. But if you feel like you do know, or you either feel like you know because you have an intuition, or you're able to logically think about the situation, my recommendation is that you don't sacrifice poor tactics for anything, right? So somebody tells you to do something and it's not safe to do that, just say, I'm not doing that, I've run into that and I've seen that happen.
And that takes a lot of intestinal fortitude. And unfortunately, most departments do not seem to have a culture that is inviting towards that.
Yeah. I mean, sure, you could do the unsafe thing and nothing will happen, but obviously there's always that chance. And then the best way to learn how to do the things or make better decisions or understand what the best way is exposure to the thing, right? And that doesn't mean like you watched Instagram or you watched a YouTube video or you listened to said person because said person said so. It's you actually going out there and doing the thing and being exposed to it so that you can, I say exposed to the situation, but you're actually exposing yourself, right? Because if you're going through the experience and you're learning and seeing, oh wow, that didn't work, you're exposing that part of you that thought that what you were doing was a good idea. And so we want to try to and it is kind of like that is the instructor portion, that is the training portion, that is the teaching portion, which is like making these students a believer in what you're teaching. Because if they can have that aha moment, like, oh yeah, this is the best way, through their own experiences, that is what is going to convince them to change their behavior.
Absolutely. I completely agree. I'm so glad you brought that up because that was the other part is not only does it vet the tactic and make sure that it works in that force on force setting, but it also instills the confidence in the person who's using it. So you can't just say, all right, we're going to use force on force and just, put these pressure test these tactics and make sure they work. And then once we make sure they work, we're going to tell them to you and then you're going to use them. No, it's like have the person use them, have the person go through that crucible and burn off the things that they know don't work, and then come out on the other side with the things that they know do work. And I'm so glad you brought that up.
Yeah, and I've taken the approach. Well, in a lot of my videos, try to do the best that I can with what I have at the moment, but trying to not just do something and say something and surely people can see that and people can, because most people aren't going to go to the extent that I go to in my
Mm-hmm.
videos to figure things out,
Mm-hmm.
which is fine because they might not have the resources to do that.
Sure.
And so I try to do the best that I can, using times, using different angles, and using these other things to try and not prove a point, but demonstrate the why, right? Rather than which is also kind of a problematic thing, because when you start doing that, people don't certain groups of people or individuals don't like the fact that you are essentially, I mean, contesting the way we've always done it or a
Yep.
new idea and saying like, hey, like, yeah, this was demonstrated and this is the reasons in which they said to use this thing, but here, let's actually like break this down and think about this from a more logical perspective. And maybe it takes a little bit more time to do that, but from here, at least on my end and within this video, maybe we can make a better decision with that
Mm-hmm.
new information.
I agree.
So, that's out there for you if you happen to make your way over there and try to look at those things. So, number 4 says the willingness to prepare to survive is more important than the willingness to survive. Do not trust that you will rise to the occasion. Instead, rely on your training and preparedness. The willingness to prepare to survive is more important than the willingness to survive. I think I know what you're saying, but what are you saying by that?
These devices reset your trigger after each shot so that you can dry fire just like you live fire in semi-auto. Plus, the Blackbeard fires a laser out of the bore so that you can track your shots and work on height over bore offset for close engagements. And the Blackbeard X uses an accelerometer to track and analyze the motion of your gun on their Mantis X app. Even the United States Marine Corps saw the training value in the Blackbeard X and began to utilize these devices in basic training. So now Marine Corps marksmanship coaches can analyze recruit shooting performance using the Blackbeard in order to make them better shooters. So stop wasting time with traditional dry fire, order yourself a Blackbeard or Blackbeard X today and start training to a higher standard. Yeah, so truth be told, this was actually stolen from a TAC Med instructor who had, when I was taking the course, he shared some really bad situations he'd been in involving tactical casualty care. But I think it's true because investing in that, your ability to survive, I think is one, it speaks to your mindset and someone who's willing to invest in that, invest in the time to go to the range, do force on force, go to the mat, whatever. It speaks to their mindset overall, but then also people, very rarely do they just rise to the occasion. Most of the time they have to default to their level of training. And so I think that is much more important than just being like, well, whenever I get to that point, I'll just be the hero and I'll save the day. It's like, well, how about you just go ahead and train so that you can fall back on that training whenever that situation arises.
Yeah, so, this is what I've talked about where I say just simply saying the most important thing is that you go home at the end of your shift, right? That's a very not nostalgic isn't the right word I'm looking for, but common phrase that I heard when I first started. And after gaining my own experiences and like kind of reflecting on the people that were saying those things, like, oh, well, these guys aren't actually doing anything to like prevent that from happening,
Mm-hmm.
preventing themselves from getting seriously hurt or killed and actually being able to go home. So, um, actually, I posted something on my Instagram about this. And I think what I said was, it's not the conflict that you need to be worried about. It's all of the work that you didn't put in before the conflict happens.
Mm.
And so what that means is, look, there's a lot of good people, there's a lot of good cops, there's a lot of really, out there seeking out the bad guy, right? And when you're doing that, surely conflict is bound to happen at some point in time. And on average, most cops, just like from a totality perspective, don't really care about the process and the journey and the work to put in before the conflict happens. The only thing
Mm-hmm.
that they are looking for is the conflict itself. And so, your willingness to prepare to survive is more important than your willingness to survive, because surely in the moment everybody has the will to survive, right? Like
Hopefully.
mentally, like I'm going to go home, I want to. But that's not what you need to be worried about, right? Because you said rise to the occasion. Well, what does that mean exactly? Like, are we justifying a good outcome because you won and he lost? Like, and what is a win? Like, if you get hurt, but he also doesn't, come out the other end of that conflict, did you win? You know what I mean? Like, if somebody else got, hurt but you didn't get hurt, and he surrenders, like, did you rise to the occasion? So
Mm-hmm.
it's really a more of a complicated um analysis that needs to happen, right, to determine whether or not you did rise to the occasion. And I will just say that if we're being, you know, um, very particular about saying what's a good job and what isn't,
Mm.
then very rarely do cops rise to the occasion. Like, it happens, right? But if you, let's just use an example, if you go 0 for 3, right, and you miss the guy completely, but he surrenders, or he's in custody, you didn't rise to the occasion. Like, the thing just happened. You didn't perform well. And so, but most people would see that as a good outcome, right? Or people do see that as a good outcome. And especially when you start, I guess the best metric to use is marksmanship, right? And so, again, we could boil it down to exactly where your rounds are hitting on the person, right? Okay, you went 3. This is the conversation I have in my class when we start talking about the marksmanship piece under stress, and the what the accountability level that I hold myself to personally is, if I shot somebody that was a threat, and I hit him, in the chest, and then in the stomach, and in the leg, or whatever, 3 for 3, okay? Now, most people would be like, oh, okay, like 3 for 3, hey, that's a good job, dude, you did good. I'm really not happy about that. You know what I mean? Because I just did something that I've never trained to do. I wasn't trying to do, and that happened. And so, to me, that's not a good job. Like, the end result was fine. And so, if we boiled it down to determining whether or not someone rose to the occasion on a marksmanship side, we could go as far as, where did you hit? Right. And if you didn't hit in locations where you're taught to hit people, that is, in my opinion, a personal failure, right? From an accountability perspective. And so, having the ability to rise to the occasion is something that is determined on the journey to the event, not during the event itself.
Yeah, and I agree with that to an extent. I think there's some situations where, just someone's combat effectiveness in terms of their accuracy based on, like, however, like an IDPA target scoring system. I think that, I'm not saying you're saying this, but I think that it's more complicated. And like, if you do hit them in the head and in the chest and in the stomach or something, it's like, okay, well, what were they doing, right? Like, I mean, maybe whenever you took those shots, that was the best thing you could have done. And then there's that. So even if someone who is like very well trained, and I still think there's going to be instances where, those shot groups are going to look not as, I guess, pretty as most people may anticipate. And then I think the other thing too is like when it comes to being prepared for the conflict, there's a dichotomy between the standard the department sets and then the individual standard that the person sets on themselves. And this is something I've been thinking about recently where, as a CCW citizen, someone who carries on a daily basis, like I set my own standard, right? Like, I mean, in terms of what standard I'm supposed to train to, that's like set by me. There's no, other than the concealed carry license, right, test, it's like a very, very low standard. That's a low bar. But I'm basically setting my own standard. But then for police, they have an organization that is supposedly understands what the standard should be, and then they set the standard at something, right? 80% accuracy on the range from certain distances or whatever the case may be. And so something else I've been wondering about recently is like, okay, how much of the blame, if we're going to assign blame, how much of the blame do we place on the department versus the individual? Because if Joe Schmo from the street, no military experience, no law enforcement experience, I mean, you have social media and like channels like yours that provide additional information that would give someone more information than their department provides. But at the same time, like, I feel like more emphasis should be placed on the department being responsible for setting those standards than the individual. Now, again, I'm torn on this because I feel like individuals should set a higher standard for themselves, but someone who's fresh out of high school or fresh out of college, like, they may not know any better. And so it's like they're trusting that their department has set standards that mean something. And I think that departments need to set higher standards. Unfortunately, though, with the state of policing right now, to set the standard that I think a lot of people would want to see, the standard that would almost invert the accuracy we see in law enforcement from, what is it? Is it like 15%? I can't, you may be, in terms of.
Yeah, it's like about 15 to 38% hit factor.
So to invert that, to say, let's say now all of a sudden it's 85% hit factor or higher. I think the amount of training that would be required for that on a departmental level is such that the taxpayer is not willing to bear that burden. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Maybe. I think I do agree that there is responsibility on both parties. I think that there's ways that the first thing is, it is what it is, right? Like, we have to operate under the terms and conditions that are set for us right now.
Sure.
And so we can have conversations about it. We can talk. We can try to sit down with people. And like I said, we could go to the legislator and be like, hey, we need this, right?
Yeah.
We kind of briefly talked about some government things before on the podcast and say, like, there's winners and losers to that, right? So, well, what are we to gain off of this? Well, what you're going to gain is a more highly trained police force that is more accountable for their marksmanship, and they're going to be like, yeah, but like, is it really a big deal, right? So,
yeah.
You could even get into the legislation on the active shooter training. Now that Texas police officers have to do because of Uvalde, right? Like, back to that thing where it's like, hey, bad event happened. Hey, we got to do something. Like, we got to do something. This was very horrific. So we got to make it look like we're doing something. And so, again, there's winners and losers to that. And it doesn't matter how many times a year you do something. If you're not the one pulling the trigger, if you're not continuously doing the thing and training the thing, you're just not going to, and we've seen it somewhat recently with some recent events, right? Active shooter events itself. Look, it's not optimal. And whenever, big government gets involved and there's people making decisions, the cost to benefit ratio and beneficial interest, you're not going to get the best product, and so, beyond that, just something that a department could do, like, departments could start paying cops for training, right?
Yeah.
We get clothing allowances, we get equipment allowances. If you want to absolve yourself from the burden of doing that, right? And again, maybe you're talking about taxpayers or whatever, however that's being funded.
Hmm.
You could give cops $100 a month for and call it a training allowance, and they are required to get whatever, take 2 or 3 classes a year that are certified, right? They can go out and seek their own.
Hmm.
And then if they don't do that, well, then there's repercussions or whatever, because that's what it's for, right? There's ways to
Yeah.
do it. Um,
You
I
reimburse
think
like
that,
jujitsu memberships or something like that. Like, I mean, there's all kinds of
yeah,
ways, models that they could use.
yeah. But I ultimately think, and so I really need to talk to somebody. I think in the community, the Surviving the Street community, there's an LAPD person in there, but talk to them about what their training schedule is like. I heard it's 1 week out of the month their officers are training. And if
Hmm.
that's true, that's awesome because, well, 1 week out of the month seems like a lot. But if
That's
that's true,
impressive. Yeah, from a manpower standpoint, that's pretty impressive. I
yeah,
mean, and maybe they have the manpower.
yeah, and I'd say it does show in the things that they do. Like the things that they do from a team perspective amongst just patrol officers is the best in the country. Like it's obvious. They're communicating well.
Hmm.
They're gathering assets before they move up to people. They have a contact cover. It's very coordinated. They know what they're doing. There's some other things they don't do so well, but it's obvious. Like, and you could see it, right? And
Hmm.
whatever they're doing, whatever they're doing, maybe that's adoptable, right? But again, like we talked about, maybe there's reasons why it's not happening.
Hmm.
Maybe it's like that's not our priority, or it costs too much money, or whatever it is. But I also think that one of the things that I'm working towards kind of solving is like training needs to be readily available to people that
Hmm.
want it, right?
Yes.
People that want it and when they want it. And SWAT teams train all the time. That's why they're better at doing the things, because they do it all the time.
Yeah.
And so, a class, 2 classes, 3 classes a year, it's not going to do it. It's not going to make you better. At the point in which you're taking, unless you're continuously taking maybe the same class over and over, um, what these classes, when you go once or you go twice a year or 3 times a year, it's a familiarization. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You're literally just going back through the motions again to familiarize yourself with the process. But I know it takes not even a considerable amount of time to get pretty good at tactical skills. Um, but it does take very deliberate effort and
Hmm.
time that you can't the amount of time it does take, you can't get it done in 8 hours and then
No.
not revisit the thing again. And so cops need to be for example, these blue guns behind me, people ask me what they are, where do you get them, and my answer is don't buy them because you can't get ammo for them, right? I can barely get ammo. I'm a
Hmm.
simunition instructor and a simunition distributor, and they will not sell it to me.
That's
Okay.
crazy.
Yeah, so, there were some recent things with the ATF and all that stuff, but I was having problems before that getting it. It's like, well, we only sell to departments. It's like, well, I'm a cop. Well, yeah, but only to the agency. It's like, well, that's problematic, because like this is what the foundation of which I based my curriculum
Yeah.
and my trainings off of. And, you know, I've talked about this, and it seems to me, and maybe it's a money thing, maybe it's an ego thing, but training is in my opinion a gate kept thing, right? And for different
100%.
reasons, right? So you have this, right? There's people complaining about the simunition thing, they're civilians or whatever. Okay, you can complain about it. I'm worried about the people that are out there carrying the gun and actually doing the thing daily, not being able to, again, have an alternative, way of achieving these skills, right?
Hmm.
So we know that departments cannot adequately do the thing in the way in which it needs to be done to build the skills. And now we're also taking away that opportunity from people who, want to do the right thing in ways in which they think is the best way possible, that quite frankly navigates around or through the red tape that is
Yeah.
commonly there. And so, it is a number of different things that I
Yeah.
don't think are going to be solved. I think that, you just have to find a way to make the training readily available. And if you can't do that, then they will never build the type of skills that they need. Like let's say people that come to my classes. So I've had mainly patrol officers. And what happens when they leave my class, right? They go back to work, okay? And they don't touch another simunition gun until they come back to my class, or
Mm-hmm.
they go through a department class where they happen to be the person doing the thing.
Yeah.
That's problematic,
Yes.
okay? And so like the way that I have my classes structured and set up, I have this conversation with them, and I say, okay, so here's kind of the deal, right? I can't guarantee that you will go back and um, get the training in the context of what we're training today with simunition in the same manner with role players. Like, where are they getting role players? Where they're, it's just like,
Mm-hmm.
it's not going to happen. But what I can guarantee is that because you came here today and you signed up for this class, you're going to go out there and you're going to start doing the thing. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so, based on the information that you learned here today and the processes that I've taught you on how to get from point A to point B, and ultimately arrive at the ability to apply marksmanship while you're out there doing the thing, remember the process, execute the process during those events, and be honest with yourself afterwards. If you didn't do it or you forgot, be like, oh man, I forgot. I'll get it on the next one. And you are essentially training yourself, about through my techniques on the job itself.
Yeah.
And like, that's something that I don't know. I think that's like maybe a new way of looking at it, right? And maybe people would say like, well, that's not good, right? It's not the best. It's not the best, certainly. But if you go to a marksmanship class, right? Let's say patrol officer signs up for a marksmanship class, or they get told, hey, we have 10 spots. Let's go to this
Mm-hmm.
marksmanship class. You guys are all going. Okay. Well, they're not going to qualify again, probably. Right. And what are they also not going to do out on the street? Shoot their gun. You know what I mean? Until it's time to do that. So they went to the marksmanship class. They tried to develop the skills that were required of them through the class or were taught to them. And even if they thought they found something that was good, the only way to replicate that is to shoot more. And if they're not doing
Mm-hmm.
it, they're also not doing it out on the street. Whatever it is they learned, unless they're at home dry firing, and
Yeah.
they're able to somehow replicate that, they're not going to be able to implement that thing. And so that's
Yeah.
just one of the things that's important to me is, here's another example. And I've had conversations with people, and I don't have an issue with practical shooting or competition shooting. I think it's great. Go do it. But when people start talking about cops need to do this, cops should be doing this, that's a conversation. Okay. It's a good conversation to have. And maybe along the way, you inspire somebody to go do it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
But, time, money, resources, the department's not paying for it.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly. Okay. And not in a way in which it's going to actually make a difference, right? Because what are if they're paying for it, they're going to pay for 5 officers that are on a marksmanship team to go do it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, they're not going to pay for, hey, well, let's
Yeah.
get all these officers. So I get it. I understand that practical shooting is a valuable thing. Okay, and that we can try to encourage cops to go do it. My perspective, though, is like that's not a solution. That's not a solution to try and fix the problem of essentially shooting too much and missing too often, because who can we actually, you have to be able to do it on a scale that is significant enough to make a difference. Like,
Mm-hmm.
could it make a difference in certain individuals' lives or their ability to do the thing? Absolutely. Is it going to change the percentage of hit factors? It's not going to, because it can't, because we're never going to actually do it. And so I don't spend a lot of time trying
Mm-hmm.
to not necessarily talk about these things, but teach those things myself, because I know that they're not going to do it. And so in my own heart, I feel like when you look at this things, okay, well, I have 8 hours with these individuals over this tactic, this technique, and this is before even, well, you have the idea of the class, you structure the class, and how you want it, but also thinking about, okay, I know cops are going to leave here and probably not do it again, right? So how
Mm-hmm.
can I make this as valuable as possible to them during the class, which is the exposure part, and then also give them something to actually do when they leave here. Give them a pathway to actually become proficient at the thing, and the way in which I do that is how I already discussed in terms of you know honest conversations with themselves during the thing. Another example is CQB, right? Not saying don't do CQB. Go learn it, know how to do it. Any patrol officer that signs up for a CQB class that has never done it before is going to leave that CQB class and almost on average, like let's just say 10% of their tactical job, a patrol officer, will involve CQB because like yeah, surely there's other valuable things within it, where you're standing, why you're standing there, when you're standing there, the
Angles,
decisions
yeah.
to move around, right? Those things are valuable. But listen, I hate to break it to you, like as a patrol cop, you're not often going to be hitting corners, hitting center fed rooms and hitting corners. And you're definitely not going to have another person with you that knows what they're doing.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's, and so like, I'm not saying I won't teach that. I actually have a class that's in the works that there is part of that being implemented into that thing in a very unique situation. But when you look at, it's hard to like teach that class on CQB and be like, okay, hey, patrol guys, when you leave here today, the next time you're doing this thing, remember this and do that. And if they're not doing the thing or practicing the thing after they leave there today, it might be 3 months before they ever like feel the need to enter a room. You know what I mean? And actually, maybe do that. And so when I, just personally looking at the courses and how to structure them and how to, um, give what I think is the best information possible to allow them to actually build the skill. Cause that's basically what I did. Like, my philosophy in the things that I teach, I developed them through the things that I was doing, but I taught myself how to do it. And I taught myself how to do it on the job because at the time that was all I had. And that can be done. You just need the information to do it. So I definitely went off on something there, but
No, I think a
um,
lot of people, when it comes to training, they treat courses almost like they're unlocked achievements. It's almost like unlocking an achievement. It's like, oh, once you go to this course, you've unlocked that achievement, and now you're good. And they don't treat it like you would treat a math class in college, right? You don't go to the math class and then be like, all right, I took the class, I'm good. I'm good for the quiz or good for the test. No, you take the class and then you go do the homework and then you take the quiz and take the test. And so going to a training course is just like going to that math course. And then you have to go do the homework on your own. And if you're paying attention, you'll know what the homework is and know what things to practice on. But most people treat it the other way. They say like once you go to the course, like all right, I'm good, and it's almost like they collect courses. They
right,
just so they can list them on their CV. But
right.
the other thing is, even if take simunition out of it, our department had a 320-degree VirtuSim simulator in one of their rooms. I don't know how much they spent on this. It's like $500,000 at least, and I used it, I think, 3 times in my like 4 years that I was there. And like that was actually kind of a lot. And use it when you get there. They use it as like a publicity stunt for the local news agencies so they'll like write an article about it. So I guess to maybe justify to the public why they spent money on it. But I asked so many times to use that thing, and I'm not saying those things are perfect. Obviously, they have their faults as well. I think it's a lot of benefits over just a typical static flat range. I asked so many times to use it, and it was always, well, we don't have the manpower. Okay, well, can I sign up to help be an instructor for it? Or, well, we don't want to get too many people signed up to be an instructor because we're worried that someone may break something. And it's like, what are we doing? And so even if you already have invested the amount of money into a simulator like that, it's still disheartening when departments don't even take advantage of it, even though it doesn't cost them any extra money other than the hourly wage and the electricity to run it.
Yeah, and that's a whole, I mean, we could talk about that too. I mean, that comes down to like, okay, the department or is it the individual officer? And like I said, let's just work with what we have and
Yeah.
understand, like try to convince officers like you're on your own, like you got to figure
Mm-hmm.
this thing out. But there's resources for you to do that. But again, another issue, why can't I just go use the range when it's available?
Mm-hmm.
You know, like why, oh well, so and so has to be there and they're not here today, or oh it's booked until December, and it's like, when on the team that I was on, we used to be able to schedule additional training days, and that was my thing. That's what I like to do. And I had the information, and so luckily for me, those individuals that were actually making the contacts with the people executing the tactics that we were also really enjoyed it and were into it. So
Mm-hmm.
that's a whole nother problem. You got
Mm-hmm.
people maybe on the team that don't like to train. So you got to work around that too. But I've mentioned this in several of my videos that and maybe it's in the class, a dry fire program. I think I mentioned it about most cops can't even go to their own range and shoot when they want to.
We
You know
couldn't.
what I mean?
We not only that, but we used to get when I very first started with my department, we would get ammunition to train with on our own. So like if you want to go, like I'm a member at a local gun club over here, so they would give me like a few, like 100 rounds or something a month to go train, and it was all like there was no accountability. It was like the guy who was the range master, he would just like hand you ammo, and then one of the later range masters or instructors, uh, he took too much advantage of that and ended up taking a lot of ammo and ended up getting fired for it. And so they cut the whole thing. Like they stopped giving us ammo full stop because of that person's actions. But I'm like, okay, this person just stole ammo because he was in a trusted position. And so because he stole ammo in a trusted position, you're just going to stop allotting ammo to the entire department. I mean, you could just set up a system where, okay, you get 100 rounds a month or whatever the case may be, which I don't think that's enough, but you get 100 rounds a month to go train with, be it on our range, or if you want to go train, if you have a membership in another range to go train at. And something else I just thought of is how strange it is that they won't, and this is the justification I usually hear, they won't let you train on their range because there's no RSO or no instructor to make sure everyone's doing the training right. I'm thinking, you give me a gun to go out into public and possibly shoot a bad guy. Where's the RSO there? Like, if you're so worried about your officers using their weapons unsafely on a range, probably shouldn't be the officers. Not to mention that you have cameras so you can see if someone's horsing around at the range. And it just doesn't make sense. But I think it all just stems back to using red tape and bureaucracy to mitigate liability and to just do the minimum, because the minimum was doing the minimum will result in the minimum amount of liability and exposure to risk.
Yeah, if departments continue to look at patrol officers as individuals who are not capable, they will always be not capable.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you were out on the range, right and you had the authorization to do that, there would probably be certain people of a certain level of expertise that would question why you're out there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. When is the first time an officer ever, typically a patrol officer ever, uses their firearm inside of a structure or mock structure? The first time that happens
Alarm call.
is in real life.
Yeah, an alarm call.
Okay. And guess what? Guess what people like the idea of allowing patrol officers to enter into a shoot house with the proper training even would be adamantly opposed.
Absolutely.
Okay.
No one would go for that.
Yeah. And it's like, whoa, hang on a second here. Like, we all do understand that getting us as close as possible to the real thing is the absolute best thing that we could do. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're telling me the first time that we're going to do that is in real life. Like, doesn't seem logical to me. Right.
Unreal.
Yeah. And then, what happens again, like, this is what happens. Like, cops perform poorly. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And departments have to look at the performance and either just kind of, well, they usually don't admit it's a bad performance, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the question internally amongst those who make decisions when it's a poor performance is like, what can we do to make them better? How do we get them to shoot less and hit more often? And I don't know if the questions are being asked and they're not getting the answer that they want. But if you want to, it all comes down to training, right? If you look at a lot of these incidents that have happened and the outrage that has stemmed from the the past 5 to 6 years in law enforcement of the things that have happened, it all really came down to like not having the right training and not holding a higher standard. Like
Hmm.
that's, I mean, ultimately, like, yeah, you could blame the suspect for the things that they did and they could have
Hmm.
acted differently. I get it. But like if the officers had better training and made better decisions, they could have prevented that ultimately from occurring to begin with. And so I don't know if at what point, if ever. I think there's this thing too where it's like this too shall pass. You've heard that, right? So
Hmm.
you think of any incident that's ever happened and think about the time between that incident and, in terms of like the way the public perceived that, right? And you look at the difference or the time between when it happened and now. Maybe nobody's talking about it anymore. Or if
Hmm.
they are, it's like, it just happened, right? So
Hmm.
it's almost like we just need to like fade this for long enough and eventually it's going to die. Eventually
Hmm.
it's going to go away. And yeah, we'll make some decisions. We'll change some things on paper. We'll fire some people, probably, or whatever. But ultimately, like, if you just want them to do the right thing to begin with, you have to get them the proper training to do it. And whether they will or they won't, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think it's managing risk. It's just managing risk is all that boils down to. And it seems like the higher ups, and maybe look, it's a complex system. I just talked to a guy yesterday about this. Complex systems are complex, and sometimes criticizing complex systems, you may not know exactly what you're criticizing. I use the analogy of an airplane. Say we're in an airplane, and say someone doesn't know anything about airplanes. They don't know how the airplane flies. They don't know whatever. And then you get some turbulence, and they look out the window and they see this freaking wing just flapping in this turbulence, and they think, you know what? If we cut that thing off, I bet we'll stop this turbulence because that thing seems to be shaking this plane an awful lot. It's like, well, you might stop the turbulence, but you might also have a short flight. And so, that's a complex system that you don't understand. And so maybe that, maybe managing risk is the best thing to do. I don't know, but it seems to not be the case. It seems that there's more meaningful things to do, and that's just doing the expedient thing. And a 40 hours of PowerPoint is not training. And I hate when they say that it's training. It can be education, it can be a refresher, but it's not training. Having a 1 hour PowerPoint on use of force is not the same by any stretch as getting on the mat and using force. And so I think that, but guess what? There's a lot less risk in that because you're not going to have the overweight and out of shape officer get injured, and then um, you're also checking the box that the state wants you to check to say that yes, we gave our officers 40 hours of in-service training. It's like, no, you didn't. You gave your officers 40 hours of education and refreshing.
Yeah, I agree that we don't know the scope of the things that you know I guess like people in certain positions know, and we don't know the
Mm-hmm.
scope of the reasons why they make the decisions they make or they don't make.
Yeah.
Um, and I agree. Yeah, we are looking at that through the only lens that is available to
Mm-hmm.
us
Sure.
to look at it through. And um, I don't know. I don't want to use the word agendas or
Mm-hmm.
beliefs or objectives or whatever those things are. But maybe it's also it is similar to, you know, um, the individual officer's way of thinking and how they make decisions and the things that they believe in and what they value, right? What they value. Okay, well, this group of individuals, although, let's just say tactical trainers, for example, like at a department, well, we know what they value, right? Because that's the job that
Mm-hmm.
they have. Presumably, they value tactical training.
Yeah.
Marksmanship instructors or firearms instructors, what do they value? Well, they probably value marksmanship, I would assume,
Mm-hmm.
because that's what they're doing. Whereas administration or staff or people in other positions, I don't have any idea what they value because they have a whole plate of different things that
Mm-hmm.
they have to
Yeah.
consider, right? And um, my position is like I think we understand that agencies or government or not government, but agencies or organizations um, don't always make the best decision that's in necessarily the benefit of the individual, right? because they're, like we talked about this earlier about cost to benefit ratio and special
Mhm.
interest, right? And things
Yeah.
like that. So they I do think a lot of the policies that there are, people, I'm sure a lot of cops don't like policies and, oh, we have to do this. And I think like a lot of the things that are there really are, some of them are really good. Like,
Mhm.
hey, don't approach cars after a felony, stop,
Mhm.
right? That's really good. That needs to be in there. Like it's
Mhm.
not even something that we could just say or train. It actually needs to be like handled appropriately if cops
Mhm.
continue to violate that thing in a
Yeah.
certain way. So there's a lot of good things, but I think ultimately, too, from a different perspective, they are accounting for the not maybe public perception, even, right? I was going to say
Oh,
public safety.
absolutely. Yeah.
I would say
Public
public safety,
optics.
but yeah, optics, public safety, public perception, and quite honestly, having to probably sacrifice those underneath you or the individuals amongst the organization in order to maybe benefit or look in a certain way to certain people. So certainly that happens. I mean,
Oh yeah, we can get into that some. And when my airplane analogy, I definitely don't want that to be used as a way of saying like I don't think we should be able to criticize complex systems, because there have been plenty of instances where it was me looking out the window and seeing the engine on fire and being like, that is clearly an issue that needs to be addressed. And so like I think that there's definitely a place to criticize and or constructively criticize those types of systems. And I don't know,
yeah.
hopefully it'll help.
Um, so we've been, was this, an hour and 34 minutes, and we offline talked to you about this list, and I said I don't think we're going to make it very far,
Yeah.
because there's just a whole lot to talk about, and it was 33 lines, and we made it to line point number 4. So
Yeah.
we
Made
had
it through
talked.
4. We're at 5, I think.
Yes, that's correct. We made it through 4. We were at 5, and we talked about probably making this a series of videos, because I feel like why not go through the whole thing? And I think that this conversation is valuable to members of the law enforcement community and whoever else might be interested in it. So I would expect that you would see us putting out more of these. And if you would like us to continue this conversation, feel free to interact on whatever platform this podcast is reaching you on. I certainly appreciate all of the interactions lately, and all the comments, the shares, and all the things you guys are doing to help us, you know, uh, get this information out to the people that need it most. So if that's something that interests you, make sure you are interacting on whatever platform this podcast is reaching you on.